Namaskar, everybody. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it and appreciate the introduction. Yeah, this is the book. Very happy that it's finally done. Paperback and Kindle, if that works for you, and maybe someday, a million years from now, an audiobook, but we'll see. Okay, so I am going to share my screen. I hope everyone's doing well. It's always up. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Now I'm the co-host.
Try again.
Okay. All right. You can all see my screen? Yes. Okay. Yeah, it's always a real treat to be with the Planetary Leadership Training. I really appreciate the invite and I'm happy to be here and I'm happy they also put up with me. I am not an easy person, I think, behind the scenes, although I don't intend to be. I'm just I am who I am. So today I wanted to talk about the ethics of intuition. I gave a similar class, frankly, about 6 months ago, but I'm just finding that it's a topic that I'm revisiting and going back to again and again. And I feel like every time I go back to that well, I learn something new. And when I feel like I'm learning something new, I also want to share that with all of you as well. Okay. So the context, at least for me, is that intuition is a huge part of what I would call the so-called conscious communities. So I say so-called because, yeah, I guess I don't really know what it means to be part of a conscious community or what conscious even means. I feel like one of the basic tenets of just psychology in general is most of what's happening is happening in the unconscious, and that's what motivates you and pushes you in different directions. And a huge part of individuation is trying to make the unconscious conscious. But I do feel like there's kind of a shadow that you carry with you everywhere you go. And certainly in the conscious communities, I think there's an enormous shadow that I want to explore regarding our conception of intuition. Okay. So this is all over social media. And I would say that this really took off during the pandemic. It peaked in the 2020 years, but it's still a very big deal. It's all over TikTok and Instagram. Just a huge emphasis on visionary states, on manifestations and channeling. You mean this has been a huge part of the history, even in Annamarga. There's an entire offshoot, with a woman who claims to be channeling the spirit of Anandamurti and can speak for him. This is a big part of what's going on in conscious communities. Is there's this idea that spiritual knowledge reveals things to you about the world, and then that's intuition, and you share it. Okay, and so I want to get into that a little bit, okay? Because first of all, I do think it's an important and radical claim that spiritual knowledge does reveal genuine knowledge about the world. So what do I mean by that? Normally, when we think about how we come to know something in the world, especially in modern day life, we think about science, okay? I have a hypothesis, I craft an experiment around that hypothesis, and then that experiment generates data that allows me to ascertain whether my hypothesis was correct or incorrect. And this scientific method reveals knowledge about the world. And I would say that there's a tendency in modern life to assume that this is the only way that you can know something to be true. And I completely feel like that's a very dogmatic perspective. In fact, the precise term for that dogmatic perspective is called scientism, when you assume that only the scientific knowledge is the way that you can come to know something as true. So on the one hand, I do think that it's important to recognize that scientism is a dogma, that spirituality does uncover genuine knowledge in the world. But on the other hand, as I think anyone paying attention to what was happening in conscious communities has seen in the last few years, there is tremendous danger to replacing expertise with charisma and assuming that if somebody has a sort of magnetic attraction and they go on screen and they have a spiritual aura or aesthetic and they start talking about the things that they have uncovered in their spiritual practices that reveals their knowledge around the world, that a lot of what's coming out can be dangerous or misleading or manipulative. I would say that as of right now, there is a pretty well-documented pipeline, at least in the United States, but I certainly witnessed it in Europe as well, between spiritual practices in so-called conscious communities, a huge pipeline that goes directly to extreme far-right politics that is reactionary and racialized at the very least, and filled with all kinds of bogus truth claims that are sort of dressed up in the language of things like visionary states and channeling and manifestations, etc. And so as a spiritual practitioner myself, I've spent a lot of time the last few years trying to think about, okay, well, what knowledge does spiritual knowledge actually reveal? What does it tell me about the world? What is intuition? And what does intuition demand of me as somebody who aspires at least to be spiritual? So those are the questions that have really been bouncing around my head the last few years. And I feel like where that has taken me has brought me to, it's helped me uncover new things about my own spiritual practice that have been of value to me. So hopefully they prove of value to somebody else. So this is the central question of today is, what knowledge does spiritual practice reveal about the world? And I would say that, so first of all, I would say that even in our tradition, there are many, many, many stories of people who talk about experiences in which they gained a kind of almost psychic intuition in the way that we classically think of it. You know, somebody has a premonition that a loved one across the world, something happened to them, or the premonition of, you know, who is about to call you right before they call you, you know, or a very strange coincidence that happens in your life fortuitously that makes you feel like you're part of some larger plan. I'm not trying to discount any of this. I do think that once you dispose of the materialist idea that the only thing that exists in the universe is just simply matter, then there's no reason to categorically say that that kind of so-called psychic or paranormal knowledge is impossible. However, I would say that we still need a measuring stick to be able to measure this sort of intuitional knowledge, because it has the power to mislead people, especially when it's coming from a charismatic figure who is broadcasting themselves on social media, with whom you have a sort of parasocial online relationship with, and from whom you're seeking guidance. We need something to be able to measure this up against. And that's what I'm interested in exploring today, okay? So we need to start with the idea of what is spirituality, because when we understand what spirituality really is, then it's easier for us to ascertain what spiritual knowledge is. And if we understand what spiritual knowledge is, it's easier for us to think about what intuition is and how we can measure it in an objective way in the world. Okay. And so when people talk about spirituality, they're often talking about their belief system. Okay. I believe in this religion. I believe in that scripture. And the problem with that kind of definition around spirituality is when spirituality is bound up with belief, it can be very divisive, because no two people, even of the same religion, believe completely the exact same things. It's in the nature of just existing in the world that the way that I think is going to be different from the way that you think. And therefore, what I believe changes moment to moment. My beliefs around my spirituality have evolved and deepened and changed considerably in the last 20 years that I've been practicing meditation. And I imagine that, all of you can relate to that. And so I think that there needs to be a movement away from defining spirituality as a set of beliefs. In the book that I just wrote that came out, the way that I put it is that we need to dethrone the centrality of belief, and we need to recenter spirituality around a practice. Okay. And so Carl Jung talks about this. He says that spirituality is your relationship to your highest and most transcendent value. And I think that there's a lot of value to that kind of definition. I would say that maybe the only problem with that is many people, especially in our society, inflate their own ego until their own ego becomes its own transcendent value, or hedonism or sensual pleasure becomes the highest and most transcendent value. And then they lead a very destructive spirituality in which their entire lives is centered around maximizing pleasure, often at the expense of other people, hence the kind of unequal society that we have right now. I mean, it's explained a lot by that kind of destructive spirituality. So the same way we need a measuring stick for intuition, we need a measuring stick for spirituality. And so I hope you'll excuse me just quoting myself here. This is out of my book, Beyond Materialism, but it was helpful for me because I felt like I'd already gone through this process of trying to articulate it. And so I could just copy and paste this. So the way that I put it there was that the practice of spirituality can be judged by whether or not it expands my thinking and expands my heart. Any spirituality that constricts my intellect, that sows fear or hatred in my heart, does not deserve to be called spiritual. So that right there signposts towards what spirituality is really about. Spirituality is not just about, in my opinion, your relationship to the highest and most transcendent value that you have for yourself. I would say spirituality is about the practice of trying to come in contact with the ground of being. And in so doing, through that journey of self-realization, there's a recognition increasingly that the truest, deepest, innermost self is connected with, penetrated by, and embedded in the larger whole. And so it's a knowledge that the distinction you normally have between self and other, between self and world, these are fundamentally illusory differences. You are nested within larger networks, and those networks penetrate you. You are not an atomized individual alone with your cell phone. You're part of a larger whole, and you embody larger cosmological dynamics that have been happening for billions of years, without you and now through you. And so that's why the practice of that spirituality expands your thinking and expands your heart, because the recognition of that truest identity, the identity that goes beyond your sex or gender or ethnicity or what have you, the recognition of that deeper identity is a recognition of your interconnectedness. It's a recognition that there is nobody who is an other. It's a recognition that you are intimately intertwined with the whole of reality. Okay. And so if we can say there is something as like spiritual knowledge, okay, I'm not trying to discount psychic experiences or premonitions or clairvoyance or anything like that, but primarily spiritual knowledge, therefore, is knowledge of your embeddedness, of your interconnection and your interdependence. And when I mean knowledge, I don't mean a kind of bookish knowledge, like I've been reading about this stuff since I started practicing meditation, but it doesn't mean that I know it. It just means that it's up here in my brain. And so the kind of knowledge that I'm talking about is a knowledge that comes out of experience. It's a knowledge that comes, so, in our tradition, it's meant to be twofold. There's meant to be an introverted way through which you approach this knowledge and an extroverted way through which you approach this knowledge. So the introverted way would be that you sit down and in a very disciplined way, you try to focus on a deeper notion of identity, so that systematically over the course of years, your mind gradually is able to expand, past the confines of where it is today, until you find yourself naturally in a place where your sense of connection with others is not something intellectual. It's something felt and embodied. So that's the introverted part of it. The extroverted part of it is that you need to throw yourself into the struggle to create a better world. That knowledge needs to be reflected increasingly through your actions, through your conduct, through your livelihood, through who you are in the world. And by throwing yourself into that project with a kind of missionary zeal, while coupled with that internal devotional practice, then it stops being an intellectual knowledge and increasingly becomes something embodied and enacted through your life. Your whole life becomes a reflection of those ideas, instead of it being a kind of aesthetic ideal that you carry around with you like it's a fashion accessory that you can virtue signal towards. It's not something even necessarily public, but it's something that is integral to who you are and how you function in the world. So that's what I mean by knowledge. Not this kind of knowledge, but that kind of knowledge. I don't know if you can see. I'm pointing to my chest. Okay. So what I'm getting at with all this is that spiritual knowledge has a moral dimension. Okay. Is it possible that, your spiritual insight can give you, a sense of things like, what kind of person is this in front of me? What are they after? Okay, sure. I'm not trying to discount that. But at the same time, it fundamentally does have this moral dimension to it, because spiritual knowledge is antithetical to the idea that I'm this atomized individual. And when you hear people talk about intuition, it's usually nested within that individualistic worldview of how you can best follow your bliss, how you best can maximize pleasure for yourself, how you best can manifest some sort of crude desire for yourself in the world. Anytime you hear something like that and you recognize, oh, that kind of knowledge totally contradicts what the spiritual worldview even is, then the person is probably just trying to sell you something. It's that simple 99% of the time. And so, we're not always in some sort of spiritual visionary state. And so I have found for my own self and my own spiritual practice that it's been tremendously helpful to have an ideological framework that I can look at with my intellect to help me judge and discriminate between where does this go, where does that go, and that helps me get to the place where I begin to naturally feel the things that we've been talking about here, that natural felt sense of interconnection and interdependence. Sometimes I'm there. I've certainly progressed in that direction, I hope, but often, most of the time, it's just me and my stupid brain. And so this sort of moral and ideological framework is totally invaluable to me. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, it's something that we all need. We need an intellectual framework that helps us discern when our intuitional sense is not as felt all the time. Okay. So a way of understanding this just philosophically in terms of what I mean by intuition and gaining intuitional knowledge, I think a really helpful model for this is understanding the yogic or tantric conception of what the mind is. Okay, and so that's the koshas. The koshas are the layers of the mind in Sanskrit. Okay, because we're talking about knowledge. And so when we're talking about knowledge, we're talking about the mind. And so when we're talking about spiritual knowledge, we should have a spiritual conception of what the mind is and what the different layers are. And that'll help us understand how intuition fits into that. Okay, so in tantric cosmology, just very briefly, consciousness is the base of reality, not matter. Okay, so a materialistic description of the mind would be that the mind is basically just generated by the brain. It's a product of the brain and the chemical interactions in the brain. And consciousness is like a kind of hallucination that matter is having, you know, for however long a living being is alive. And then that hallucination disappears as long as the brain stops functioning and it goes away forever. Okay, that's matter being at the base of reality. This is that flipped upside down. Consciousness is at the base of reality. And the reason why there's a material structure to the universe is because consciousness is deeply involved with matter in the first place. Okay, so the mind is a reflecting plate for consciousness. Okay, and the koshas refer to the 5 layers of the mind. And those 5 layers of the mind form a bridge between consciousness on the one hand and matter on the other hand. And the mind, which is that bridge, allows consciousness to embody itself in the universe and interact with matter. Okay, there's matter, there's consciousness, you need a bridge. Mind is that bridge. And so these 5 layers move increasingly from the consciousness substructure towards the material superstructure. So the cruder your mind, the less it will reflect the subtlety and the depths of consciousness within. And the cruder your mind, the more you're going to think of yourself as an individual who's distinct from all individuals, who needs to look out for him or herself alone at the expense of everybody else. You know, that sort of selfishness is a reflection of a kind of crude mind which only recognizes matter, which doesn't recognize a deeper interconnection. You know, so the subtler the mind, the more clearly it will reflect the consciousness within and have that consciousness illuminate its entire being. So what that means is related to what I was talking about before with spiritual knowledge. The subtler you're able to make your mind through meditation and service and other spiritual practices, the more your mind and your life will clearly reflect that spiritual knowledge that you are embedded within the whole, that you are interconnected with and interdependent upon the whole, and that you are not just a separative unitive self. You're a reflection of something that is much larger, and it's incumbent upon you morally to enact that through your life. You are more like an actor playing a part of a larger drama, and you are intent on being a positive part of that instead of a negative part of that. That's the work of a subtle mind. So the crudest layers of the mind, the crudest koshas, are more dominated by their close relationship to matter, because remember, it's a bridge between matter and consciousness. And the subtlest koshas are more dominated by their closeness to the consciousness that is at the ground of being. Okay, so I'm actually going to go only through the 4 crudest koshas this time. The 5th kosha can be left for another lesson, you know, for the purposes of what we're talking about here, because I want to focus mainly on the ethics of intuition here. Okay, so the crudest layer of the mind is called Kama Maya Kosha. Kama means desire. What you see in the quotation marks is just a model that I have found helpful for myself. You can disagree with it if you want. You can have your own take on it. That's fine. This is just my take on it. It's been because Sanskrit is not my first language either. These Sanskrit terms can be alienating sometimes, even for me. And so I have found it helpful to create my own terms that help me conceptualize what am I talking about here. So my conceptualization of the Kama Maya Kosha is the instinctual mind. So this is the crudest layer, the layer that's most deeply involved with its relationship with matter. And so in Tantra, all of the koshas are related to one of the chakras, which are ascending up the spine. So the Kamamaya kosha, the crudest layer of the mind, controls the first chakra at the base of your spine. And it's directly connected to the material world. It directly mediates your relationship with matter, okay? And so it's mainly driven by physical appetites, not even so much desire as much as appetite. So what I mean by that is desires can be on a whole gradient between crude and subtle. And when we talk about appetites, it's I need to eat. It's instinctual more than it is psychological. And so that's why I'm saying physical appetites. And so the main 4 physical appetites that are talked about in Tantra are hunger, sleep, reproduction, and fear. Those are the main appetites, appetitive desires. And so you can imagine, if your mind is dominated by this lower layer, it's almost amoral more than it is immoral. So immoral is I know what's the wrong thing to do and I do it anyway. That's immoral. Amoral is like I don't even recognize that there is such a thing as right or wrong. It's a very amoral layer of the mind. It's animalistic, it's instinctual, it needs to be controlled. If you don't have control of your ability to mediate your physical appetite and your hunger, you can harm your body. And the same thing goes with any of those other instinctual aspects of the mind. And so next, this one subtler layer up is called the Manomaya kosha. Mano means mind. And so I think of this as the thinking mind, what we normally think about when we think about the mind, which is interesting because almost everything that we talk about when we talk about a person's mind in Tantra is the second of the crudest layers of the mind. And there's 3 more above it, which are more important and subtler. Just an interesting thing to point out. So, these shapes, by the way, these are the shapes of the chakra that kosha controls. So this kosha controls the Svadhisthana chakra, which is the second chakra at the root of the genitals. This is the layer of the mind that's responsible for thinking and remembering, okay? And so this is the aspect of the mind that you exercise in your meditation, in which you try to focus the mind in a particular way and focus your attention and train your attention in a particular way, often with the help of breathing or a mantra or a visualization. This layer of the mind is concerned with pleasure and pain, okay? And so every kosha can be thought of as having almost its own morality and its own spirituality. So the Kamamaya kosha is very instinctual. Like I said, it's like amoral. The Manomaya kosha is really where you sort of see the difference between there's a right and there's a wrong. And I can think about the difference rationally between what's right and what's wrong. And the way that Anandamurti puts it is that the world religions don't go deeper than the Manomaya kosha, because there's mystical traditions within these religions, but the exoteric forms, in other words, the most basic form of the world's religions as we see them, including even Buddhism, because the way that most Buddhists practice Buddhism is not the kind of Buddhism that the Buddha practiced. It's more about, going to a pure land after you die. In other words, attaining heaven. Okay, the attainment of heaven can be seen as the maximization of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. That is seen as the entire conception of what it means to lead a religious life for most people, not all people, of course, but when there's this focus of heaven and hell, anytime you hear those ideas, that's just the Manomaya kosha. That's just pleasure and pain and the morality associated with those two things. And so this part of the mind also, it needs to be cleared. It needs to be controlled so that you can recognize that your desire for pleasure and your desire also to avoid pain, can also largely be cowardly. Okay, it can be selfish. It can be petty. It's very, very, very difficult for anybody, certainly me, to transcend this aspect of the mind that is so obsessed with pleasure and pain for even a moment. You know, like Anandamurti has this one talk in which he talks about the different kinds of devotion that a person has. He talks about tamasic, rajasic, and sattvic bhakti. So to translate into English, it's like static, mutative, and sentient devotion. And he says that the second layer of devotee, which is the second crudest, a very crude devotee, their devotion is, oh God, remove this disease from me. I don't want to be in pain anymore. And that's me. We're being perfectly honest. Like, okay, I have aspirations to be a spiritual person. I try, I meditate. I understand the importance of these ideas, but most of the time, I just want to avoid pain. It's like I'm a little animal hiding in a cave and doesn't want harm to come to me. It's so hard to transcend these cruder aspects of what it means to be a being in a material world. Okay, so moving up, the Atimanas Kosha, I call it the archetypal mind, archetype being a term that comes from Carl Jung, his conception being that the psychic world is dominated by images that tend to be cross-cultural, an archetype being, one example of an archetype would be the Senex figure. Senex is Latin for like the old wise man, which you see in a million different manifestations, including even in pop culture. You have Dumbledore, you have Gandalf, you have Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. These are all just manifestations of the Senex archetype, okay, the old wise man. So the archetypal mind is subtler than the Manomaya Kosha, which is very concerned with pleasure and pain, and therefore incredibly egoistic, okay? I think people underestimate how much their intellect is actually just controlled by unconscious motivations, the seeking of pleasure, the avoidance of pain, and emotion. It's irrational. Most of it is irrational. And whatever irrational belief or desire you have, the intellect will reorganize itself around that, which is why modern discourse can be so confusing when everything seems to have two sides, and every political side has such a well thought out, logically constructed argument about why they're right and why they would need to own the other side as being stupid. It's because the intellect is at the slave of emotions. We need moral clarity to be able to cut through the noise. Okay, and that's what, for me, what this is all about. So the Atimanas Kosha controls the Manipura chakra, which is at the abdomen. And so this is where the seeds of sanskaras are. So sanskaras are, in case you're not familiar with this term, every time you perform an action, that's karma. You perform an action, and by performing an action, your mind becomes pregnant with the seed of a reaction that needs to come later to sort of balance out what you just did, And so that's how people normally conceptualize karma, is good actions will lead to good outcomes and bad actions will come to bad outcomes. And the Buddha spent an enormous amount of time talking about this in the Dhammapada or the Dharmapada, depending on what language. The way he puts it is that you are what you think, having become what you thought. And those who always act from a benevolent place have a happiness that follows them like a shadow that will never leave. In other words, the more you are able to be guided by a kind of compassion and benevolence, the more that joy is a natural state of your being. Okay, I'm just trying to explain what sanskaras are. The point is that if you're able to transcend the part of your mind that is purely egoistic, that is purely just obsessed with pleasure and pain, okay, then you reach a much subtler part of the mind that is at the root of your sanskaras, okay? So the way that Anandamurti puts it is one of the reasons why you should be very dubious or mistrustful of so-called psychic knowledge is, he gives this example. He says a father has a sick child, and the father goes in front of the statue of a deity and prays to the deity for a week and fasts and doesn't eat or drink and is just, begging and praying for their son to be cured. And then in the middle of the night, after not eating for a week, a vision of the god comes alive and says, this is the medicine that you need to give to your son. And he gives the medicine to his son, and the son is cured. And an ordinary person thinks, oh my God, God came to me through this particular form. And what is actually happening is that, at the root of your being is consciousness. It goes much deeper than your intellect, your manomaya kosha, which is the second crudest layer of your mind. And so all the knowledge of the universe is there within you, but normally you have no access to it, because the cruder layer of your layers of your mind are obscuring that knowledge. And so this father has a sort of one-pointed, concentration that is also aided by the fact that, they're not eating or sleeping or drinking or anything like that, and enters into a non-ordinary state of consciousness and gains some actual knowledge about the world. But then it's filtered through the Atimanas Kosha. In other words, that father's experiences, that father's cultural conditioning, that father's sanskaras. And instead of recognizing that the knowledge came from his own self, he sees it as the deity that he was praying to coming to life. In other words, all knowledge, including even intuitional knowledge, is filtered through your own conditioning, through your own sanskaras. The way that I read that is through your own nonsense, through all the crap that's floating around in your brain. For me, it might be Yoda comes to life and gives me a medicine. I don't know, because I probably have a deeper relationship with Yoda than I do with some other deity. Okay, it's dependent upon the individual. And so you have to be very mistrustful when people say that they gain some knowledge. They gain some knowledge perhaps of their Atimanas Kosha and their own sanskaras, but it's extremely difficult to be able to differentiate between what is actual knowledge that's coming through and what is a sort of cloud that's covering that knowledge that comes from a layer of the mind like the Atimanas Kosha. And so because this is where the seeds of sanskaras are, where all of your conditioning, your psychic conditioning is held, this is the layer of the mind that's responsible for your sense of aesthetics and beauty, and it determines what you're attracted to and what you're repulsed by, okay? And so this, again, is a much deeper knowledge than pure egoistic knowledge, just pure intellect, but it's still fundamentally, it's conditioned by your circumstances, whether they're your present circumstances or even from a past life, okay? It can't be completely dependent upon. If you want direct intuitional knowledge, it has to transcend not just your sense of separateness and individuality and your ego. It also needs to transcend all of your psychic conditioning and sanskaras, which is extremely, frankly, for me, it's even impossible to conceptualize what that looks like, because it goes beyond my ordinary sense of who I am. It points to an identity that is deeper than Amal and this face that I wear, this mask that I'm wearing in this life that I think of as my personality. And so that leads us to the next layer of the mind, the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the layer of true knowledge. I call it the conscientious mind. And so that's the Anahata chakra right here at the midpoint of the chest. And so this is the first layer of the mind that actually transcends your sanskaras. In other words, the way that I think of it in my crude layman's terms is this is the first layer of the mind that's not polluted by all of your crap, by all of the nonsense that's floating around in the cultural sphere and in your lifetimes of conditioning, okay? And so this is the first layer of the mind that's able to see past personal prejudices and attractions and judgment, okay? Because it's like a direct connection to the consciousness that's at the core of your being. And so this is the seat of intuition, okay? But as we've been getting at, and the reason why I feel like these coaches are such a helpful model, how do most people think about intuition? You know, when we think about intuition, it's like, oh my God, I don't know whether I want to be with this person or with that person. So I'm going to go to a crystal shop and I'm going to sit down with a psychic and they're going to tell me who I should date and who I shouldn't date. Maybe there is a right and a wrong here, but we're fundamentally talking about, in that circumstance, the ego's ability to maximize pleasure and avoid pain, which is the Manomaya Kosha, okay? It's rooted in a sort of illusory sense that who you really are is this ego that desperately wants to avoid pain and desperately wants to enjoy life as much as possible and is constantly thinking that that's the goal of life. It represents not spiritual knowledge, but spiritual delusion. That's what we're trying to transcend, not because we're against enjoying life, but because if you allow that aspect of the mind to be in the driver's seat, to control who you are and what you believe and how you orient yourself in the world, that's what I mean when I say people make their own egos the highest, most transcendent values, and they orient their lives around that. That's why we live on a planet in which we are exterminating 200 species a day. That's why we're in the middle of the 6th great mass extinction. That's why we're destroying the life support system of this planet. That's why we've created an economic system that is so disastrously and psychopathically unequal that the vast majority of people in this planet have to spend all of their energy just trying to survive, while another tiny group of people amass trillions of dollars for themselves, okay? That sort of world is a reflection of the worldview that we are bringing to bear to it. And as long as we don't recognize that that egoistic way of looking at the world has disastrous limitations to it, the more that we're going to see that being played out throughout history. We have to go deeper than that if we want to create a better world. And if we want to create a better world, we have to recognize that spiritual knowledge goes deeper than who we should date and who we shouldn't date, and what job we should have and what job we shouldn't. It goes deeper, in other words, than your personal pleasure and your personal avoidance of suffering. Okay, and I meant to have these bullet points come up one at a time, so I'm sorry about that. I'll just start at the beginning. So when we think about ethics very briefly is the study of human morality, but really what ethics is what does it mean that something is good? Okay, what is the good? How do we seek the good? How do we orient our lives around goodness? Okay, and so briefly here, I wanted to talk about 2 different approaches that people normally talk about in the philosophy of ethics. There's many more, but these, you could argue that these are like the 2 main thrusts. The first is deontology, which is morality should be based on the results, not the intention. So in other words, if I am honest with somebody about what I think, it doesn't matter. Honesty can't be held up as the highest value because I might hurt their feelings. And so there needs to be a higher value than that deontologically, because I'm judged by the results and not the intention. Often that's being held in tension with an idea called utilitarianism, which is that whatever is the action that helps the maximum amount of people should be the one that I take. And so the one that you often see sort of going through the pop culture sphere these days on this is the trolley problem. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. I'm happy to go into it. So basically the trolley problem is this idea that you're driving a trolley. Well, I shouldn't say you're driving a trolley. You have control of a trolley. And on the tracks is a person that's tied up to the tracks, okay? And that trolley is headed towards that person. It's going to kill them. You can change the track, okay? You can have it move onto a different track, but on that other track are 5 people, okay? I actually just ruined it. It's actually opposite. It's meant to be that it's headed towards 5 people, but you can change the track and it's going to kill 1 person. And so people hear this and most people instinctually think, well, it's better for me to just kill 1 person. so I'll kill the one person for the benefit of those 5 people. That's utilitarianism. I'm going to complicate that for just a little bit, okay? So I'm going to take a situation that is ethically exactly the same to help you recognize how it's much more complicated than you think, okay? Let's say that there's one healthy person, okay? And I can kill them and harvest all their organs, okay? And if I harvest their organs, I can save 5 people's lives, okay? Most people understand that we shouldn't just go around murdering healthy people and harvesting their organs just because there's 5 unhealthy people that we could save. That's ethically the same thing as saying, I'm going to kill, this one person to save 5. So that's a more complicated view of this problem. But what we're talking about different here is very different from these approaches. It's the intuitional perspective on ethics. Intuition being the direct knowledge based on your experience of spiritual connectedness. And so that's, in other words, your direct experience with the Vijnanamaya Kosha. And that knowledge has a moral, ethical dimension to it. And the 2 aspects of that knowledge, Anandamurti would define as Vivek and Vairagya. So Vivek is discrimination between right and wrong, not just discrimination between saying it's better to tell the truth than to lie, but the discrimination to apply a principle to a situation and to recognize in the situation what is the appropriate action to take, which is a much more difficult thing. Because in the situation, you have all of your cultural conditioning. You have what you're going through in your life in that moment, whether you've eaten or slept properly and what your mood is, how selfish you happen to be in that moment, how you personally feel about the situation. All of that is sort of clouding it over, okay? This would be a more direct knowledge based on your direct relationship with consciousness. Vairagya is the ability to understand how to use an object of the world so that it's for the welfare of all, instead of just somebody's selfish pleasure. And in tantric cosmology, there's not a tension between the individual and the collective in the same way. Because, okay, so normally when we think of the world, we think, there's the individual and then there's the collective, and the 2 of us exist in tension with one another because I want to be able to do whatever I want, but I'm constrained by the fact that I live in a society. And so I can't have absolute freedom because the collective also might be harmed by my absolute freedom, okay? And so that's typically seen as the tension between the individual and the collective. But this is a resolution of that tension because spiritual knowledge is knowledge that the separation between the self and the collective is actually fundamentally an illusory one, that the truest, deepest self is embedded within the whole. And so in other words, your self-interest, your so-called self-interest is not about your selfish pleasure. It's about your spiritual progress. And your spiritual progress is about you coming into closer contact with the whole that you are embedded in. And therefore, there isn't, at the deepest level, there is no tension between self and collective, meaning that an object can be used for the welfare of all, not the pleasure of all. And that's very, very different, the difference between spiritual welfare and selfish pleasure. In neo-humanistic philosophy, it's the difference between Atma Sukha Tattva, which is the principle of pleasure, and Samasamaj Tattva, which is the principle of social equality. So all of this can go a lot deeper. There's so much more to explore here. But this is just my very basic framework for creating a measuring stick that we can apply to the world to understand, okay, what do we mean by intuition? What kind of knowledge is revealed? And how can we discriminate when we're encountering people who claim to have this kind of knowledge? So hopefully there was something here that proved interesting or useful to you. Like I said, the only reason why I share it is because for me, it has been useful. It's been tremendously valuable for me to have an ideological framework in my life, because if I don't have that ideological framework, then it's just my Manomaya Kosha in the driver's seat. And my Manomaya Kosha, my ego knows no bounds. It is always obsessed with pleasure and always obsessed with avoiding pain. And so this has helped me to, for however brief a time, try to see past that. So thank you very much, and namaskar. And hopefully this opens up an interesting and fruitful dialogue.
Thank you, Amal. Thank you very much. I appreciate insight and, of course, your honesty. Thank you. Yes, please. We're going to open up for question and answer. So please, you can use the chat. You can raise your hand, and we can open your mic. But please take the opportunity to ask some questions. Yeah. Give everybody the opportunity. Again, you can use the chat or just raise your hand. Oh, we have Shiva's raised his hand. Yeah, go ahead, Shiva.
Namaskar, Amal. That was delicious, and that there's a lot to unpack there. And I agree with you. It really helps to walk around with some framework and not just some knee-jerk reaction and getting pulled and tugged with, like you said, depending on the conditioning of your mind on that at that particular moment. There's 2 points that I would like your thoughts on that occurred to me while you were presenting. One is a lot of the world religions are dualistic in nature versus ours, which is monistic, where we don't, like you said, there is a convergence of the individual and the collective, that really it's one and the same thing ultimately. And I'm wondering if that framework in some of forms of spirituality or religions that are dualistic in nature might also be part of the difficulties that we see when it comes to ethics and trying to drive our ethics from that source, that spirituality, and getting, making use of that, being able to perceive what the real viveka is in terms of making these decisions. And another is the archetype level that you were discussing, the Ati Maya Kosha. So there could be the archetype at the individual level, but maybe even a collective archetype. Like what's the health? Like take a pulse and see what our collective samskars are, and whether that collectively needs to be changed and raised in order to improve the conditions of society. If you have thoughts on either of those two, their impacts and what could be done about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, those are really interesting questions. Regarding the first question, I feel like Hinduism actually has a pretty sophisticated understanding of this. So, because Hinduism is non-dualistic, of course, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like, from my understanding of Hinduism is it's almost trying to create a place for everyone. And so it sort of says that, eventually, you might be in a lifetime in which you're ready to seek moksha and understand the non-dual nature of reality. But most of us are not there. And so Hinduism is a sort of framework that allows people to approach God as if God were a dualistic external entity. And there's a million different manifestations of that, non-dualistic Brahman, that can manifest as Shiva or Vishnu or any of the deities of the Hindu pantheon. And the dharmas that are a part of Hinduism are about leading a good life so that maybe some lifetime from now you might be ready for the real truth, the non-dualistic truth of the universe. I would say that most religions are more sort of classically dualistic, but even those dualistic ones, like Christianity, have mystical traditions which are completely non-dual. And the archetypal truths of Christianity and all of these world religions are extremely interesting and compelling when you think about them from perhaps a non-dualistic perspective. Just the idea that in order for me to get in touch with God, God needs to die, and it needs to become a human and die so that I can die to my humanity and be born again into God. that's an extremely deep notion that is applicable to, our conception of spirituality, as long as we don't think about it dualistically and literalistically. And so, yeah, I would say that our tradition is non-dualistic in an uncompromising way. I feel like what it's trying to do is it's sort of trying to get rid of all the extraneous noise and extraneous symbolism. And it's like, here's point A, that's you. Here's point B, that's Paramapuruša. What's the most direct line between you and that? And I appreciate it for that reason. And I feel like once I have that conception, it's easier for me to try to recognize the dharmic aspects of all of the world religious traditions, which is Dharma expressing itself within the particularity of a particular, time, place, and person and culture and moment in history. So I feel like that relates to your second question about collective archetypes. Carl Jung famously basically said that the reason World War II happened is because Germany had developed a negative relationship with a particular one of its archetypes, basically the archetype of Odin, which is an extremely strange thing to hear from an ordinary materialistic conception of history and why the Germans did anything. But if that's compelling to you, I would really recommend, maybe you have already checked out the writings of James Hillman. James Hillman was a psychologist who basically insisted that you need to treat the archetypes as real and not just imaginary entities, because your mind treats them as real. And the more you're able to think of them as real entities, the more you're able to see how you are essentially living a life in which the archetypes are animating themselves through you. And you can either do that in a conscious way or an unconscious way. Like the ancient Greeks, for example, they had a very different conception of the psyche. And so the ancient Greeks, it wasn't so much that you were a lustful person and therefore behaved in a particular way. The ancient Greek conception was more that you were possessed by a god called Eros. And because you were possessed by that god momentarily, you behaved in a particular way because the god enacted itself through you. You could say that the archetypes are enacting themselves through you. You are sort of possessed by your sanskaras. And so that's an interesting conception, because anything that you bring to the light of your consciousness that you can be mindful of, you have a certain amount of power over. You have the ability to choose suddenly in a way that before maybe you didn't. And certainly I feel like that can be done at a cultural level, at a mass level, instead of just an individualistic level. So hopefully I'm addressing what you're saying in a way that's satisfactory to you. So somebody else is raising their hand, Elda.
We're going to have to bring Devesh out of translation. Jai, can you bring Devesh out of translation?
Yep.
Thank you. Elda, go ahead.
Gracias, Namaskar. Yo
Namaskar.
quiero preguntarle al respecto de qué es el hilo de plata y el hilo dorado, que yo leí del príncipe Gaudama, que es el último Buda. Él tuvo un escrito, un libro de hilo de plata y hilo dorado.
I understood most of that. Namaskar.
Okay,
Maybe the
fantastic.
interpreter could help me.
Devesh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sure. She's asking about what's the meaning of this silver core and the gold core that she wrote, that she read in this book. I don't remember the name of the book. But were you able to get it, Amal? The silver core?
I don't know what this refers to, the silver core. Where is that from?
Let me ask her again.
Okay.
Elda, where did you read? Elda, ¿cuál es el nombre del libro? ¿Lo puedes repetir?
Hilo de plata hilo dorado.
No, el libro.
No sé, pero yo he leído, o sea, en el libro, la carátula del libro decía algo, hilo de plata, hilo dorado. Y yo eso un poco asumía. Está en muchas culturas lo dorado, y el color dorado del chakra dorado, y el plata sería el otro chakra también de que está arriba, cerca de la pineal, cerca en el cerebro. Entonces, debe ser eso, debe ser esa conexión, hilo de plata, hilo dorado, llegar a esa conexión, no quedarse, por ejemplo, en el modo del bien, del mal, o sino del deseo, de todas las 4 cosas que hemos visto. Tal vez dentro de esas 4 cosas está ese hilo dorado, hilo de plata. Namaskar.
Namaskar. So, what is she saying, Devesh?
Yeah, she's trying to relate the silver and gold cord book that she wrote a few days ago.
Oh, that she
with
wrote.
the 4 koshas that you described on the. I'm not quite sure because I don't understand the silver and core meaning, but she's trying to explain that it's related to how to achieve this 5th kosha.
Well, if she shares the book with us, maybe we can check it out. I mean, I'm certainly interested. Is there anybody else who has a question or something that they want to share?
Okay, we do have 2 things in the chat, but they're not questions, but they're just comments. From Jeremiah, it said, interesting in the line of thought, the strength it has. And Tavartia wrote, Namaskar, Mom. Thank you so much. Always giving a new path for thoughts to move on. Oh, I did, Jeremiah, that was Yoda. Do we have some more questions? Please use the chat, or please feel free to raise your hand. We have a few more minutes. Jeremiah, do you have any good questions for us?
Don't be shy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, namaskar.
How is this related to Kohlberg?
Oh,
I don't
Are
know.
you-
What's Colbert?
Kohlberg. He has a formula for moral decision making. Kohlberg, Lawrence Kohlberg.
I'm actually not familiar with that. I'd be happy to check it out,
Okay.
though.
Yeah, Dr. Lawrence Kohlberg.
Is he part of like a particular tradition? Is he a philosopher?
I believe so. He has it's a chart for moral decision making.
Interesting. No, I have no familiarity with it, honestly. But
Okay,
I'm
it's
always
kind of-
looking
it's-
for new things to read, that's for sure.
Lawrence Kohlberg. I came in late, so I didn't get to hear all of your presentation. But check that out, and maybe it's something that is related to your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kieran, Mai, were you saying something?
yeah, sure. So what really popped in my mind was it's a lot about how we do and take actions based on our relationship with what is innermost to us. And whenever something exterior happens, it's really hard to judge. But when it's affecting the greater good per se, then we can maybe draw some lines and was it ethical or not. But ultimately, it's something that happens from the personal relationship of that person with the best of his or hers. And the point being, some people have not grasped the values of yogi ethics yet, and still they're trying to do their best.
Mm-hmm.
But we can, examples come to my mind more than subjective things. But we have here in Brazil lots of like political figures who are in a certain line of thought and even religious relationship, and they claim to be doing something ethical because of some religious ethical paradigm. and that stands because people think it's all right because someone is doing something based on this kind of ethic, you know. And that, yeah, it's not a question, it's just a matter of discussion, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
when it does affect greater good.
Yeah. No, I think that what you're saying is really valuable. I mean, I immediately think of the United States, in which the politics are very divided and people feel very strongly about their position. But what I almost never see in the political discourse on either side is the notion that there should be any personal sacrifice involved, you know? And so, for example, there's the political left in the United States talks a lot about equity and creating a more diverse and inclusive country for everybody. But those same people, by vast majority, more than 80%, if you go to counties where they all live, they will do everything in their power to write the laws so that working people and poor people are not able to live in their counties, because it's a sort of idea that, well, I just want to help them in the abstract, but if they live here, they could harm my property values. And suddenly the most important concern is about selfish pleasure, you know, and all the other concerns was just a sort of aesthetic idea of what kind of person they think they are. And so everything goes out the window. And I imagine that's not unique to the United States. It's difficult, I think, for a lot of us to conceptualize our politics as being related to our personal lives and how creating a better world demands something of us, and it involves sacrifice. I just don't see the whole notion of sacrifice being played up as a value, even, you know. I think people just, I think there's just a much larger conception of how can I get as much as possible for myself, you know, and politicians who reward people's sense of grievance succeed, you know, and rise to the top. And so politics becomes a competition between the worst people in your country instead of the best. So,
yeah, it's pretty much the same here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's certainly something I've seen around the world. I remember I left the United States. I lived in Europe for a few years, and I remember the first time I left was right in 2004, right after this guy named President Bush was reelected, and that was probably my peak despair. Like, I just couldn't believe that happened. But yeah, one of the things I realized very quickly living in other countries is, yeah, you see different versions of the same thing playing out everywhere. There's no pure, wonderful utopia out there. It's just us, you know, continuing to ruin our own societies and our own worlds.
Absolutely. It's like a mass conscious thing.
Yeah.
It has bigger mass right now. So,
anybody else?
I was going to say something. I hear what you're saying, Amal, but I guess, you know, and this is not maybe appropriate for what we're discussing right now, but at the same time, it's like, how do we change this? How do we shift this?
Yeah, well, that's like a whole different discussion, like you said. But I mean, of course, that's the $10 million question. All I can tell you is I'm the navel-gazing intellectual. I'm not good at answering questions like that. I'm good at sitting in an ivory tower and wondering about existence. Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear what other people have to say about that, because the truth of it is that I'm constantly having to fight against a very deep pessimism in my psychology. You know, I think my fundamental belief is that humanity as a whole doesn't seem to learn until there's just a massive crisis. You know, it's like the world wars whereas the tenets of nationalism failing catastrophically on the world stage, and it took something as horrific as the world wars to shift human beings away from that even a little bit, because it's still such a powerful idea and there's resurgences of these ideas all the time, but I feel like the only reason why it hasn't completely possessed the world is because it did possess the world and it failed so terribly, and so I do feel like to a certain extent that's just how, at least at the collective level, how we progress is through horror, and I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. Let's see. Laura Jacobson just said, your livelihood, your choices, contributions reflect your ideology. You're not only
Oh.
navel-gazing intellectual.
Thank you, oh dear wife of mine.
Oh, that's beautiful. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, no, we're almost at the end of our session today, but Amal, I just, every time you join us, I swear, like all of our conscious minds expand. So thank you. What you
It's
bring.
really always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's such a joy to have you. And I ordered your book, so
I
I'm
hope you
looking
enjoy
forward
it.
I'm looking forward to it, and I did put it in the chat.
Cool.
So yeah, and I would love to have it on audiobook too, because I love reading a book and then I love listening to it on audiobook again.
Well, one thing I'm going to say about this book, because I recognize that this is obviously a shameless plug what I'm doing, but no offense to anyone here, but I didn't write this book for you guys. I wrote this book for your skeptical friend that you don't know how to talk about your spirituality to, but you really want to,
That's what I'm hoping for.
this is that's the purpose of this book. Is ideally I want people who are maybe open-minded, but not necessarily in a community like this. That's who I'm writing it for. And so, yeah, I just hope that it provides something of value to somebody. So
Well,
I
fantastic.
hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I do. And again, thank you for being here.